Diane Cooper pushed open the front door with the weight of someone who had carried not only the burdens of her workday, but also years of unspoken fatigue. The late evening air of Wichita still clung to her jacket, warm and stale, but inside the house it was worse, a suffocating mess that greeted her like an unwanted guest. The kitchen was the first thing she saw. The table, once neatly set in the mornings, was buried under dirty plates crusted with food, greasy cups, and the stench of ketchup spilled and never wiped. Cigarette butts lay scattered across the surface, and a sticky puddle had spread across the floor, dark and tacky beneath the fluorescent light. An overturned mug with a dried ring of coffee lay on its side, like a mute witness to the chaos. Diane stood in the doorway, her body aching from the hour-long bus ride after her shift, the cramped seat still imprinted on her back. She had cleaned this kitchen before leaving in the morning, wiped the counters, put away last night's dinner, made sure everything was ready for the day. She had even prepared food for Robert, her husband, who didn't leave for work until 10, and for Hannah, their 22-year-old daughter, whose shift at the grocery store wasn't until the afternoon. Yet nothing had changed. No, everything had changed, but for the worse. The sight of it all broke something inside her. She dropped her purse onto a chair already cluttered with laundry and lowered herself heavily onto another, the edge of the seat biting into her legs. Her hands trembled as she buried her face into them. Tears slipped through her fingers, falling onto the dirty tabletop. She wasn't crying just because the house was a wreck. She cried because she had a husband and a daughter, yet lived as if she were completely alone. The thought was bitter, sharp as glass. Nobody in this house saw her exhaustion. Nobody asked if she was well, if her back ached from lifting heavy grocery bags, or if her spirit felt hollow from endless routine. To them, she was a machine, one that cooked, scrubbed, washed, folded, and made sure the household ran like clockwork. Robert still called himself the breadwinner, as if that excused everything. But what did his paycheck mean when he couldn't so much as carry a grocery bag or wash a plate? He could name every brand of beer in the store, but not the last time he had asked his wife how she was feeling. And Hannah, her only daughter, grown and old enough to know better, acted as if adulthood meant freedom from any responsibility. She worked part-time at the register, yet never contributed a dime to the household. She bought cosmetics, clothes, gadgets, and left the bills for her parents. Worse than the money was her disdain. Hannah didn't cook, didn't clean, didn't even put her dirty laundry into the basket. Diane's tears came harder, her chest tightening as though grief itself were strangling her. The mess around her was only a mirror of her life. She had long stopped hoping that Robert or Hannah would lend a hand. What hurt wasn't the labor, it was the invisibility. They treated her as if she were second class, a servant in her own home. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her skin. Her eyes moved from the table to the living room, where clothes were scattered across the floor, socks and shirts tossed carelessly. Even the bedroom wasn't spared. Their marital bed had become just another battlefield of untidiness, sheets tangled and unwashed. In Hannah's room, underwear was strewn across the carpet, the closet doors left open with piles of clothes spilling out like a storm. The house was loud in its silence. Robert would be home soon, grumbling about dinner, leaving his shoes in the hallway, flipping on the TV before saying a word to her. Hannah would breeze through, earbuds in, phone glowing, never noticing her mother's swollen eyes. For a moment, Diane let her head rest on the edge of the table, her tears soaking into a napkin that should have been thrown away days ago. She thought of all the years she had poured into this home, into this family, and wondered how it had come to this, a woman with a husband and daughter, yet lonelier than she had ever been. In that kitchen, surrounded by the filth of other people's disregard, Diane Cooper felt the crushing weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. She wasn't living, she was surviving, and in that moment her tears were not just from exhaustion, but from the dawning realization that something had to change, though she had no idea yet how or when. Diane lifted her head from the table and let her gaze fall unfocused on the clutter around her. In the stillness, her mind drifted back, unbidden, to the days when life felt full of promise, when Robert had been more than just another burden on her shoulders. She remembered the first time they met. It was at a campus party during their junior year at Wichita State. The air had smelled of cheap beer and pizza, and the music was too loud, but Robert's laugh had cut through the noise. Back then, he was tall, easygoing, quick with a joke. She had come with a friend, and he with another girl. Yet somehow they had ended up talking in the corner about classes, about favorite movies, about where they saw themselves after graduation. He had seemed so interested, so engaged. By the second party, they arrived separately but left together. Long walks across campus at night became their ritual. They would stop for late-night coffee, argue over which professor was the toughest, share secrets about family and dreams. Robert was attentive then, quick to reach for her hand, eager to listen. She had fallen for the way he made her laugh, the way he carried himself like someone who would always step up when needed. Their wedding came just a year later, a modest ceremony, but filled with joy. They were young, poor, and optimistic. Robert had started working at a local auto shop while Diane finished her degree. When Hannah was born not long after, Diane left her classes behind, and Robert took on extra shifts. Back then, it felt like a partnership. He would run to the grocery store after work, sometimes surprising her with flowers tucked between the bread and milk. He washed dishes, even cooked the occasional stew, proud of how she praised his effort. They would bundle Hannah into the car seat and spend weekends at the zoo or eat ice cream in the park. But those golden years slipped away slowly, almost without her noticing. Robert grew tired of helping around the house. The excuses came one by one. That's not men's work. Or, you know better what groceries to buy. His hands that once helped with dishes now only reached for the remote or a cold bottle of beer. The laughter she had loved was replaced by grunts, complaints, and the hum of the television that never seemed to turn off. And Hannah, once a bright-eyed child eager to tag along on family outings, entered her teenage years like a storm. She dyed her hair in garish colors, pierced her nose, stayed out late with friends Diane didn't know. Arguments became daily battles. Diane pleaded with Robert to step in, to set boundaries, to guide their daughter. But he shrugged it off. You're the mother. You deal with it. I don't understand girls. The distance between husband and wife widened with every night Robert sat glued to his computer screen, headphones blocking out the world, while Hannah slammed doors and shouted about freedom. Diane stood in the middle of it all, invisible, her voice drowned out by their indifference. Those memories, so vivid in her mind, pressed down on her chest like a weight. She had once believed in the idea of family, of shared burdens and joys. But now the only thing left was the echo of what used to be, a partnership eroded into silence, a marriage hollowed out, a daughter who barely looked at her anymore. Sitting there in the messy kitchen, Diane felt the ache of those years more sharply than ever. The love that had once carried her was gone, replaced by the cold truth that she was nothing more than a servant in her own home, a shadow of the woman she used to be. The smell of fried meat still lingered in the air when Robert came home. He dropped his boots in the hallway without looking up and trudged straight into the kitchen, switching on the television in the living room as he passed. Diane had just finished setting plates on the table, her hands moving in automatic motions, tired but precise. Dinner ready yet? Robert muttered, cracking open a can of beer he'd brought with him. He didn't even wait for her answer before taking a long gulp, the sound of his swallowing louder than his words. Diane slid the plate toward him, pot roast potatoes, a loaf of bread cut unevenly in her haste. He looked down and frowned. Couldn't you have cooked it a little longer? Looks dry. She bit back a reply, lowering herself into her chair. Hannah walked in a moment later, phone in hand, screen glowing against her face. She sat down with a dramatic sigh, dropped her phone beside the plate, and stabbed at the meat with her fork. One bite, and she grimaced. Seriously, Mom? You never season this right. It's either bland or way too salty. Don't you taste it before you serve it. Diane's chest tightened. Her fork hovered above her own plate, appetite gone. She had spent her day on her feet at work, dragged groceries home in bags that cut into her palms, cooked the meal they were now tearing apart, and yet all she received were complaints. Robert chewed noisily, shaking his head. Maybe next time just make a stew. At least you can't ruin that. The words hit harder than he realized. Diane looked at both of them, her husband drinking beer like it was water, her daughter scrolling through her phone between bites, not once looking up to see her mother's face. A thought rose uninvited, sharp and frightening in its clarity. What if I weren't here? What would happen if one day I just disappeared? The silence inside her own head answered quickly. They wouldn't know how to manage. Robert would grumble, sure, but who would wash his clothes, put meals on the table, remind him of his doctor's appointments? And Hannah, she could barely take her own dishes to the sink, let alone run a household. Without Diane, the fragile rhythm of their lives would collapse in a matter of days. Yet neither of them seemed aware of that. They sat at the table as if she were invisible, their words cutting but casual, as though she were some service they were entitled to, not a human being with a heart that ached. Her eyes burned, but she forced herself not to cry, not in front of them. Instead, she gathered the plates once they were done, scraping half-eaten food into the trash. Hannah left the table without a word, her phone buzzing with a new notification. Robert leaned back in his chair, the television calling him louder than his wife's silence. Diane stood at the sink, staring at the dirty dishes piling higher, the water running but untouched. The roar of it filled her ears until all she could hear was her own voice inside. They don't see me. They don't care. I am nothing but a shadow in this house. She gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, and drew a shaky breath. A seed had been planted, small but undeniable. She didn't know when or how, but the thought of leaving, of breaking free from this cycle, had taken root. And as Robert barked from the living room, "Don't forget to bring me another beer," Diane knew with chilling certainty that the woman she used to be was slipping away, and the woman she needed to become was waiting, just beyond the walls of this suffocating house. The next morning, Diane arrived at the office with the same heaviness she carried every day, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee that did little to wake her. The building smelled faintly of printer toner and stale air conditioning, the kind of place where time seemed to blur into one long week. She slid into her cubicle, straightened a stack of files, and tried to focus, though her body still ached from last night's dinner table humiliation. Not long after, her supervisor, Mr. Andrews, appeared at the edge of her desk. He was a kind man in his way, gray at the temples, but today his eyes didn't meet hers. "Diane," he said quietly, "can you come into my office for a moment?" Her stomach dropped. She followed him down the narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the walls. Inside his office, he motioned for her to sit. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, but his hands fidgeted with a pen. "I'll be straightforward," he began, his voice low, almost apologetic. "The company's going through a rough patch. Budget cuts, payroll reductions. We're going to have to let some people go." Diane sat very still, watching the pen roll between his fingers. "I see," she said, her voice steady. He cleared his throat. "You've been here a long time. You've done good work. But we can't afford to keep everyone on at the same rate. If you were willing to write a resignation letter, make it official as voluntary, it would save the company from having to pay severance. In return, we'll make sure you get your full paycheck through today. No delays." The words hung in the air, heavy and yet strangely liberating. For years, she had carried the fear of losing her job. Now, faced with the reality, she felt something unexpected rising within her. Not panic, not shame, but a quiet sense of release. She straightened in her chair. "So if I write this letter today, you'll make sure my wages are paid in full. Through this afternoon." He nodded quickly. Yes, we'll process it right away. A small smile touched her lips. All right then. I'll draft it now. It took her only a few minutes. The words, "I resign," effective immediately, looked stark on the page, but she signed them without hesitation. When she handed the letter to Mr. Andrews, his relief was obvious. "Thank you, Diane." "I'm truly sorry," he said, almost whispering. She rose, shaking his hand gently. "Don't be. Maybe it's time for a change." An hour later, she walked out of the office building with an envelope in her bag. Her paycheck, every cent accounted for. The sun was bright against the glass windows, and for the first time in years, the weight pressing on her chest lifted. She stood on the sidewalk, cars rushing by, people hurrying to their own routines. She should have been terrified, unemployed, uncertain of the future. But instead, she felt light, as though a locked door had swung open. The job that had chained her to exhaustion was gone. The complaints at home would continue, yes, but now she saw it clearly. She didn't have to stay trapped. She had just been given proof that life could shift in an instant, that escape was possible. As Diane walked toward the bus stop, the Kansas wind tugging at her hair, she realized that what she carried in her bag wasn't just money, it was permission. Permission to imagine a different life. When Diane stepped back into the house that evening, the air was heavy with the same old staleness. The kitchen looked as though no one had touched it since she left that morning. Plates from breakfast sat stacked haphazardly in the sink, crumbs littered the counter, and an empty cereal box leaned against the wall. The living room bore its usual wounds. Socks flung onto the couch, Robert's jacket tossed over a chair, Hannah's sneakers abandoned in the middle of the floor. It was as if the day had been waiting for her return, waiting for her to put it all back together. But tonight, something in her had shifted. She didn't feel the usual pull to clean, to sigh and pick up after them. She stood still in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Quietly, she moved to the bedroom. She pulled out a duffel bag, the one they usually used for weekend trips that never seemed to happen anymore. Methodically, she folded a few changes of clothes, tucked in her toiletries her wallet, and a folder of documents: birth certificate, social security card, marriage license. The bag wasn't heavy, but it felt momentous, as if each item she placed inside was a declaration. I matter and I am leaving. She sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, the mess of Robert's clothes scattered across the floor around her. She reached for a notepad on the nightstand, tore off a sheet, and wrote in steady block letters, "I left. Don't wait. No explanations, no apologies." She folded the note once and left it on the kitchen table, right beside the half-empty ashtray. With the bag slung over her shoulder, she slipped out the door before anyone came home. The evening air wrapped around her like a secret. She walked briskly down the street toward the bus station, each step steadier than the last. Inside the terminal, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the rows of plastic chairs smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The schedule board flickered overhead, listing destinations across the Midwest. She scanned the names until one caught her eye, not because she knew it, but because she didn't. A town with a simple, almost tender name, somewhere far enough to feel like another world. She bought a one-way ticket with the envelope of money still fresh from her final paycheck. When the bus pulled up, she climbed aboard, settling into a seat near the window. The engine rumbled to life, and the city she had known for decades began to slide away, street by street. Diane pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching Wichita's lights blur into the darkness. There was no fear, only an odd exhilaration, as if she had slipped free of invisible chains. By the time dawn broke, the bus rolled into the small town. The streets were nearly empty, bathed in the pale gold of early morning. Storefronts were shuttered, sidewalks quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of dew and fresh earth. It was the kind of calm she had forgotten existed. She stepped down onto the pavement, duffel bag in hand, and drew in a long breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing to fix anyone's mess, wasn't hurrying to make herself useful. She was simply standing in a place where no one knew her name, no one expected her to serve. The weight on her shoulders lightened with the rising sun. Diane Cooper, for the first time in a long time, felt free. The bus station was only a few blocks from the center of town, and with the dawn still fresh, Diane walked slowly, her bag heavy on her shoulder, but her steps oddly light. She passed shuttered shops with old-fashioned signs, a bakery releasing the warm smell of bread into the morning air, and a narrow diner already lit inside. The streets were calm, the quiet broken only by the occasional car. For a moment, she felt like she had wandered into another life. She found a small roadside motel at the edge of town, the kind with faded paint and a neon sign that hummed even in daylight. The woman at the front desk barely looked up, sliding a key across the counter after Diane paid for 3 nights. The room was simple, one bed, a dresser, a lamp with a cracked shade, but to Diane it looked like luxury. The sheets were clean, the surfaces empty, the air unmarked by stale smoke or clutter. She set her bag down and stood there, absorbing the silence. After a quick shower, she changed into fresh clothes and decided not to waste the morning. She locked the door and strolled back into town. By then, the diner she had passed was bustling. She slid into a booth by the window, ordered coffee and pancakes, and let herself savor the moment. The syrup was too sweet, the coffee a little bitter, but it was perfect. She was eating not because someone else needed her to serve them, not because she had to hurry and clear the table, but simply because she wanted to. It felt like a vacation, her first in years. She lingered after breakfast, watching townspeople filter in. A group of construction workers laughing over eggs and bacon. A mother with a toddler. 2 older men discussing weather patterns like it was the most important news of the day. No one knew her here. No one demanded anything. She could just be. Her phone vibrated on the table, breaking the spell. The screen lit up, Robert. She flipped it face down. A minute later, Hannah. Then Robert again. The buzzing continued, relentless, as if the device itself were possessed. Finally, Diane opened the phone, scanning the string of messages. Where are you? Why didn't you make dinner? The house is a mess. Hannah's hungry. Come back right now. The tone wasn't worry, it was entitlement, like they had misplaced their maid. Another string arrived, this time from Hannah. Dad says you better stop this nonsense. I'm not cleaning up after you. You think you can just leave? I have to work today and I don't have clean clothes. Thanks a lot. Diane stared at the screen until her vision blurred. A laugh, bitter and sharp, escaped her throat. Not a single message, asked if she was safe. Not one wondered if she was okay. She took a breath, typed slowly and hit send. You're grown. Manage without me. Then she turned off the phone, slid it into her bag, and returned to her coffee. Outside the window, the morning sun had risen higher, casting long golden rays across the quiet street. Diane lifted her cup and drank, tasting the warmth, savoring the silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she wasn't bound to that house anymore. She was free, and freedom, even in the form of pancakes and black coffee in a nameless town, was the sweetest gift she'd ever given herself. For the first few days, Diane lived as if she were on borrowed time, savoring each hour like it was a delicacy she hadn't tasted in years. She walked the narrow streets of the town, pausing to admire storefronts with painted windows and flower boxes. She stepped into the local museum, its quiet halls filled with artifacts of prairie life, quilts and farming tools, photographs of settlers whose eyes carried the same weariness she often felt. She sat alone in a dark theater, eating popcorn while the flickering light played across her face, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had watched a movie without someone tugging at her sleeve for attention. Each evening, she returned to her motel, body pleasantly tired, spirit lighter than it had been in decades. She would drop onto the bed, stretch across the clean sheets, and think, this is what peace feels like. But by the end of the week, the envelope of cash from her final paycheck was thinning. Motel rates, even at this modest place, were higher than she had expected. Meals at diners and cafes, while comforting, chipped away at her savings. She sat one night on the edge of the bed, flipping through the bills in her wallet, the reality settling over her. Freedom was sweet, but it also came with a price tag. The next morning, Diane decided to walk a little farther from the motel, into a part of town she hadn't explored yet. The streets here were busier, lined with bakeries, thrift shops, and small restaurants. As she passed a cafe with large windows and the smell of fresh coffee spilling into the street, she noticed a paper taped to the glass door. The words were simple, typed in block letters. Help wanted technical worker. She hesitated, rereading the notice. Technical worker sounded formal, almost intimidating. But curiosity nudged her inside. The cafe was warm, filled with the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation. Behind the counter, a young woman in an apron greeted her with a polite smile. "I saw the sign," Diane said, nodding toward the door. "Technical worker." The girl grinned, knowingly. "It's just a fancy way of saying we need someone to help with cleaning. Dishes, tables, maybe sweeping at the end of the day. If you're interested, I can call the manager." Relief washed through her. Work she knew how to do. Work she had been doing for years, without thanks. Only this time, someone would pay her for it. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s appeared, dressed neatly but not stiffly. He introduced himself as Edward Parker, the assistant manager. He explained the details, hours, pay, duties, with a straightforward kindness that surprised her. No condescension, no impatience. Just the facts. "When could you start?" he asked. Diane hesitated only a second. "Today, if you'd like." Edward smiled, extending his hand. "Then welcome aboard." As she shook his hand, Diane felt something shift inside her. The pay would be modest, the task simple, but this was hers. Not an endless obligation demanded by others, but a job she had chosen, a place where her work would be seen and valued. She left the cafe that afternoon with a staff apron folded under her arm and a lightness in her step. For the first time in years, Diane wasn't just surviving, she was building something new, however small. The cafe became Diane's new world, a rhythm she quickly grew to cherish. She slipped into the role easily, apron tied at her waist, hair pulled back, hands moving with practiced efficiency. She carried trays of dirty dishes from tables, wiped crumbs from counters, loaded the dishwasher until its steady hum became a kind of background music. She swept the floors each evening, the scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air after she locked the mop away. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Each task had a beginning and an end. Unlike at home, where her efforts vanished into the void, unacknowledged and expected to be repeated endlessly. Here, when she cleared a table, the customers smiled and thanked her. When she handed clean dishes back to the line cooks, they nodded with genuine appreciation. Her co-workers treated her as one of their own. Most were younger, college students earning money between classes, a few single mothers working double shifts. They joked with her, included her in their chatter, and never looked down on the tasks she performed. In their eyes, she was part of the team, not a shadow doing invisible labor. And then there was Edward Parker. He wasn't the owner, but he carried himself with calm authority, the kind that didn't need to shout. He noticed things if the dishwasher jammed, if the supplies were running low, and fixed them without drama. He spoke to Diane respectfully, explaining procedures with patience, never once making her feel small. "Good job today, Diane," he said once as she finished wiping down the last row of tables. "You've made things a lot smoother around here." The words were simple, but they struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. At home, praise had disappeared years ago. In fact, the only response to her labor there was silence or worse, complaint. But here, someone saw her, acknowledged her effort. With each passing day, Diane felt something stir inside her that she thought had died long ago, dignity. She wasn't just keeping a roof over ungrateful heads. She wasn't invisible, taken for granted. She was useful, valuable, part of a whole that depended on her. She caught herself smiling more often. Even when her back ached at the end of a shift, it was a different kind of ache, earned, not imposed. She would return to her motel room, set down her shoes, and feel satisfaction instead of resentment. In quiet moments, she reflected on the strange irony of it all. For years, she had scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and folded clothes at home without a word of thanks. Now she was doing almost the same thing in a cafe, yet the difference was night and day. The labor hadn't changed, but the respect had, and that respect was what gave her back a piece of herself. For the first time in years, Diane looked in the mirror and didn't see just a worn-out servant of her family. She saw a woman making her own way, a woman who deserved to be acknowledged. Slowly, carefully, she was beginning to believe she was worth more than the role she had been confined to. One evening, after closing at the cafe, Diane walked back to her motel room with the faint scent of coffee and cleaning solution still clinging to her clothes. She had just kicked off her shoes when her phone, long silent, began to buzz. The screen lit with a name she hadn't seen in weeks, her old friend Marlene. She hesitated before answering, but curiosity won out. Diane? Finally, Marlene's voice burst through the line, equal parts relief and urgency. I've been trying to reach you. Do you have any idea what Robert's been posting? Diane frowned, sinking onto the bed. Posting? On Facebook, on those community groups. He's painting himself as some poor abandoned husband. Says you ran off, left him and Hannah to starve. People are lining up to comfort him, calling you selfish, ungrateful. He makes it sound like you destroyed that family. The words hit like a punch, though not with the force they might have weeks ago. Diane's hands clenched in her lap. She had expected Robert to sulk, to lash out at home. She hadn't expected him to air their life online for strangers to gawk at. Marlene sighed. I thought you should know. He's got plenty of sympathy, mostly from women who don't know the first thing about him. And Hannah? She's echoing his posts, commenting right under them. Diane closed her eyes, a dull ache spreading behind her temples. She knew what was coming, but she had to hear it. She opened the messaging app and scrolled through Hannah's page. There it was. Her daughter had updated her status to married. She was joking, of course, a careless act of rebellion. But beneath the joke lay her real allegiance. She had chosen Robert's side, defending him with sharp words, blaming Diane for walking out and leaving us to clean up the mess. The betrayal stung more sharply than the public humiliation. Her own daughter, the child she had carried, nurtured, shielded from storms, turning her into the villain for strangers to judge. She set the phone down, her reflection caught in the darkened window. Once, this would have broken her. Once, she would have begged for forgiveness, pleaded to be understood. But now, after weeks of breathing air not filled with demands, after hearing thank you spoken in the cafe more times than in her own home, she felt something different rising inside her. It wasn't despair. It was clarity. There was no place left for her in that house, not because they had shut the door, but because she no longer wanted to step back inside. Robert could cling to his story, Hannah could side with him, but Diane knew the truth. And the truth was that she had carried that family alone for years, and they had never once looked at her as anything more than a pair of hands. She drew a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs like it was a vow. The past was severed. No matter how loud Robert's complaints grew online, no matter how Hannah echoed them, Diane was free from it. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of being without them. She was afraid of ever going back. For several weeks, Diane noticed small surprises waiting for her in the storage room at the cafe. At first, it was a single daisy left in a paper cup, its stem tilted but alive with color. Then came a wrapped piece of chocolate tucked beside the cleaning supplies, a tiny note that simply read, "For your hard work." Another time, it was a small apple polished to a shine, set on the shelf like a token from a secret admirer. Each discovery left her with mixed emotions. It was flattering, of course, to be noticed in such a quiet, thoughtful way. Yet it also unsettled her. The cafe was staffed mostly by young women, college students working part-time, and a few men, the head chef, two rotating security guards, and Edward Parker, the assistant manager. Who among them would leave such tokens? She tried to guess. The younger security guard? Too shy, barely spoke beyond polite greetings. The older one? Too gruff, and usually more interested in his cigarette breaks than anything else. The chef was friendly but loud, known for playful banter with everyone. It didn't quite fit. That left Edward, but the thought seemed absurd. He was her manager, composed, professional, older. Why would a man like him leave daisies and chocolates in secret? Still, the mystery followed her through each shift. She caught herself glancing toward the storage room more often, heart quickening at the thought of what she might find there. Every time, there was something waiting, never extravagant, always small, but each one chosen with care. Then, one morning, she arrived earlier than usual. The cafe was quiet, the chairs still stacked on the tables, the smell of fresh coffee just beginning to drift from the kitchen. She headed to the storage room to hang her bag and stopped short. Edward Parker was there, standing with his back to her, setting down a small bouquet of wildflowers in a glass jar on the shelf. For a heartbeat, Diane froze. Then the sound of her footsteps betrayed her. Edward turned, surprise flashing across his face before softening into a faint, almost sheepish smile. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them seemed fragile, like it might shatter with a single word. He lifted a finger to his lips, as though embarrassed to be caught. Then, after a pause, he spoke, his voice gentle. "I owe you an explanation, Diane, but not here, not while we're on the clock." He straightened, his usual composure returning. "Would you allow me to take you for a walk this evening? After your shift. Just a walk. Nothing more." Diane's breath caught. Her first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of silence. But something in Edward's manner, his steadiness, his respect, stilled her fear. "All right," she said quietly. 7 o'clock, he replied with a small nod. "In the park, by the fountain." And then he stepped past her, leaving the faint scent of aftershave in the air, the bouquet of wildflowers standing bright against the gray shelves. Diane lingered there, her hand brushing the petals. Her heart was unsteady, caught between disbelief and anticipation. For years she had been invisible, unseen even in her own home. Now someone had noticed her, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a woman. The park was quiet when Diane arrived that evening. The fountain at the center glimmered under the fading light, water spilling gently over stone as the last of the day's heat gave way to a cooler breeze. She had almost turned back twice on her walk there, nerves tightening her chest, but something steadied her, the same quiet courage that had carried her out of Wichita, out of her old life. Edward was already waiting, a small bouquet of daisies in his hand. When he saw her, his expression softened, his usual professional reserve replaced by something warmer, almost vulnerable. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering the flowers. She accepted them hesitantly, their simple beauty making her throat ache. For a moment, they walked in silence, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. Then Edward spoke, his voice low but steady. "I suppose I should start with honesty. My wife passed away 10 years ago. Cancer. Since then, I've raised my children, watched them grow, and now they live their own lives. They call, they visit, but I live mostly alone. The house is quiet. Too quiet." Diane listened, the weight of his words pressing gently against her heart. "I wasn't looking for anyone," Edward continued. "But when you walked into the cafe that first day, I noticed something in you. The way you accepted the work, without complaint, without shame. You carried yourself with a dignity most people overlook. You were kind to everyone, even when you were exhausted. And slowly, I found myself leaving those little tokens, hoping to brighten your day the way you unknowingly brightened mine." He paused, turning to face her beneath the shade of an old oak tree. His eyes, usually calm and professional, now held a naked sincerity. Diane, I know this might sound sudden, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you. I've seen your strength, your resilience, and your kindness, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? The words struck her like a gust of wind, leaving her breathless. Marry him? They had barely spoken outside of work. Yet, as she stood there, daisies trembling in her hands, she realized she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Her mind flickered back to Robert's cold silences, Hannah's disdain, the endless cycle of invisible labor. Then back to this man, standing before her with open hands, offering not demands but devotion. A tear slipped down her cheek. Yes, she whispered, almost in disbelief. Yes, I will. Edward's smile widened, relief and joy mingling in his expression. He reached for her hand, and together they continued their walk, the evening light wrapping them in a glow that felt like promise. In the weeks that followed, Diane filed for divorce. The process was straightforward. Robert, still busy nursing his grievances online, barely contested it. Hannah visited once, their conversation clipped and tense, but Diane no longer sought approval. Her future no longer hinged on a daughter who could not yet understand. By the time the papers were finalized, Diane had already moved into Edward's home. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with warmth. Books stacked on end tables, photographs of his children, and soon enough, touches of her own life woven in. When they stood before a small group of friends and coworkers and exchanged vows, Diane felt as if she were finally stepping into the life she deserved. Epilogue. 3 years later, the cafe still bustled, though Diane no longer worked there. Instead, she managed the books for Edward's small chain of cafes, her skills and patience serving her well in this new chapter. Each morning, Edward left a small gift by her bedside, a flower, a note, sometimes just a piece of fruit. The tradition had never stopped. It had simply moved from the storage room to the intimacy of their shared home. Neighbors and friends often remarked on the couple, how tenderly they treated each other, how their love seemed both steady and luminous. People called it a late romance, but to Diane it felt timeless, proof that even after years of loneliness, happiness could still arrive, soft and unassuming, like daisies left quietly on a shelf. And when she looked at Edward across the breakfast table, his eyes bright with affection, she knew that her story had not ended in despair. It had begun anew, in love discovered when she least expected it,